Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Hello again, I'm Paul Barter, your host. This episode marks the 1-year point since the trailer episode for Reinventing Parking in July 2018. And in this episode, I'm going to weave together a bunch of excerpts from episodes of Reinventing Parking from the last year. And the theme of this episode is minimum parking requirements and getting rid of them. I actually created this episode for my other podcast, Reinventing Transport, in order to introduce some of the ideas from Reinventing Parking to the audience over there. But, of course, it's relevant here, and I hope you'll find it a useful and interesting episode. So here goes. Parking, in particular minimum parking requirements. What's wrong with them, and how you can push to eliminate them, or at least reform them. First up is Carlos Pardo, who was on Reinventing Parking in September 2018. He's from the Despacio organization in Bogota, but now with the New Urban Mobility Alliance, NUMO.
Parking is a not sexy topic, and it's a very nerdy topic, and that's what maybe makes people say, okay, it's boring, just put more parking.
But then he goes on.
Well, it's really wonderful. You can do so many things with parking, and if we could find the best way to demonstrate this, if they think about it a little bit more and just do this small effort, they will get a lot. It's like vitamins or like these things that you have to take when you're a child and you don't want to take them because they taste ugly. You have to take it and you have to understand that this is important. Don't be a child. Learn parking.
Bitter medicine may not be the best analogy. We need to sweeten the deal somehow, and let's look for ways to make this a sweet deal. There's a mindset in parking policy that every building should be required to handle its own parking demand. And this mindset translates into the idea of minimum parking requirements, the focus of this episode. They're also called minimum parking standards, or just parking minimums for short. And a lot of us in the parking reform movement are trying to get rid of parking minimums. Here's Todd Littman with a brief comment on what's wrong with requiring parking.
Generally, a car costs less than a structured parking space. And we give away parking, we don't give away cars, and yet it would be cheaper to give people a car but make them pay for the parking rather than what we currently do.
So one of the reasons that requiring parking with new buildings is a problem is that parking is so expensive to provide, and it increases the cost of that building a lot. The building code requires other things, of course, and they're not such a problem. We require toilets with buildings, but toilets are much cheaper to provide than parking. And a further problem is that parking, again, unlike toilets, for example, and various other things that are required, parking takes up a lot of space. So if you require even a sort of fairly run-of-the-mill amount of parking with your buildings, your city is going to be requiring a huge amount of parking to be built. Here's Andres Sanudo from the Mexico City episode of Reinventing Parking. Mexico City is one of the success stories in reforming and eliminating, in fact, minimum parking requirements. You'll hear more about that throughout this episode.
We were finally able to say how much parking we were creating in the city. And we found out that around a little bit more than 40% of the square meters that were being built in the city were devoted for parking. And it was more than any other land use. It was more square meters for parking than for housing, for offices, for services, for retail, for anything.
Andres was talking about his work with ITDP in Mexico, pushing for reform of parking minimums. Here's Todd Littman again.
Okay, the highest parking requirements are typically imposed on restaurants and bars and pubs and taverns. On one hand, we're telling people don't drink and drive. On the other hand, we're assuming that most people who are going for a sociable evening of drinking are going to get there by driving their cars.
There's a serious point here too.
What does that do in terms of the location of development? Let's say you wanted to open up one of those really nice microbrewery pubs in your residential neighborhood. What is going to be the constraint in a typical American residential suburb? The parking requirements. So not only are we encouraging people to drink and drive, but we're making it almost impossible to create those nice neighborhood pubs that are within convenient walking distance of most people's homes.
In Indonesia, ITDP is also working on parking, amongst other things, and Yoga Adiwinarto talked to me recently about the situation in Jakarta. ITDP found a huge oversupply of parking as a result of decades of minimum parking requirements.
Just one little exercise that we did along the MRT corridor on the north part, prominent promenade in Jakarta. We did the survey along the road, and I think it's only like 5 kilometers long. And then the amount of parking is about 38,000 spaces, like off-street parking on those buildings. I mean, no wonder, Jakarta is congested every day. Like the road capacity is pretty much lower than that.
So minimum parking requirements create a cross-subsidy. It's not necessarily a government subsidy, although there are some government subsidies for parking. But here's Todd Littman on why such a subsidy is a problem.
In urban areas, any place where land is valuable and you have to start building structured parking, that parking is very expensive and that subsidizing it is both economically inefficient and unfair. It's inefficient because it encourages people to own more vehicles and to drive more than they would if they paid directly. And it's unfair because it forces people who don't drive to subsidize the parking costs of their neighbors.
So requiring too much parking causes all kinds of problems. In fact, there are many other problems it causes in addition to the ones Todd mentioned. But the other side of the coin is that the reason cities have parking minimums is to try to address the chaos in the streets from parking and the conflict in the streets from parking. And that problem can be really serious. Here's Shreya Gadapalli from ITTB India.
Unfortunately, even parking has become a matter of life and death. There are many cases which are reported almost every day about how people are fighting for parking, how people ended up shooting each other or harming each other, people dying over parking. So it has become quite a severe issue. And it's very important that we take action to make sure that the issue of parking is solved.
Sorry about the quality of that little snippet. My interview with Shreya from India was the first one I did, and I'm gradually getting the hang of this podcasting game. So we have this problem. We've got this excessive supply of off-street parking, and yet we've got a problem in the streets as well in many cities. And in fact, very often in the very same places, you'll find an excess of off-street parking, and yet there's chaos in the streets. Jakarta is an example of that. Here's Yoga again.
Parking space are really abundant, off-street parking space, and also on street, you can still see in the local roads, and especially the road with so many restaurants, and then parking just blocking not only the road but also a sidewalk. It's very common to have good sidewalk with cars parked on top of it.
So that's weird. Jakarta's minimum parking requirements haven't fixed the on-street parking problem. Or maybe it's not so weird. Here's a snippet from ITDP India's Shreya Gadapalli again, explaining that something similar is happening in Indian cities too. In this case, city-built parking structures are not solving the problem.
Our own office in Delhi is in a fairly upmarket area in South Delhi, and the city went ahead and converted a fairly flourishing and vibrant park into an underground parking garage, which was meant for what is called pay and park in India. Mm-hmm. And the pay and park has languished sitting empty while there is excessive parking that's happening on the street because there is practically no management or enforcement of parking on the street, on ground level around this parking lot.
Aha, that's the key. As Shreya just mentioned, it's the on-street parking management that needs to be there. People won't use the off-street parking if the on-street parking is not properly managed. There's no point requiring off-street parking or subsidizing or building extra off-street parking unless you manage the on-street parking. In fact, if you manage the on-street parking, you may not need to require or subsidize off-street parking. Here's Todd Littman again.
Cities should do everything they can to efficiently manage the on-street parking. In most locations, there's really no overall parking problem. The conflict is usually over the most convenient parking spaces. And those are often the on-street spaces right in the commercial district or in nearby residential areas.
Now, the focus of this episode is minimum parking requirements, but Todd goes on to give the very basics of on-street parking management.
A municipal government does have to do everything they can to ensure that those prime parking spaces are managed for efficiency so that they're really being used by the people who deserve them most. For example, in a commercial area, the on-street parking space should be regulated and priced so that delivery vehicles and people running a quick errand and people with disabilities who are picking up or dropping off passengers, or that those high priority uses can virtually always find an unoccupied parking space because you've got the regulations and the pricing system down. You've done it correctly. And that means that the lower value uses, which is typically the commuters or somebody that's parking all day in an area, that they have the motivation and the information that they need in order to park somewhere that there's fewer conflicts. That's often 2 or 3 blocks away, or it might involve paying to use an off-street parking lot.
One political difficulty with all of this, of course, is that pricing on-street parking, and in fact pricing any parking, is unpopular. The most recent episode of Reinventing Parking, June 2019, tackled that issue of how to make pricing of on-street parking less unpopular. So, before we return to the topic of minimum parking requirements, which is our main focus today, let's have a quick listen to one of the suggestions from that episode. This is all relevant, of course, because if we want to abolish minimum parking requirements, we need to get our on-street parking better managed, and that means making it politically possible. Here's the excerpt. It was a solo episode by me. Equity or fairness will always be a key line of attack on any pricing proposal. It's understandable, and it deserves to be taken seriously. So suggestion 20 is, point out that badly managed parking is not fair or equitable. If on-street parking in busy areas is not well managed, who gets the most convenient parking? Usually it's people who arrive early and park all day. How is that fair? We also know that weak parking management with no parking fees can lead to on-street chaos, road danger and congestion. For various reasons, those impacts tend to fall heavily on disadvantaged groups. But there's more. Parking chaos and congestion caused by parking mismanagement prompts cities and other governments to devote huge chunks of taxpayer money to easing those problems with supplies such as subsidized parking supply, road expansions and so on. That kind of investment benefits high-income motorists much more than low-income people with lower rates of car ownership. It prompts high parking minimums too, which harm housing affordability, and promotes sprawl, which hurts the poor too. So it's an equity strength that parking pricing can help prevent these outcomes. A blanket statement saying parking pricing is inequitable is inaccurate. So this is a simple message. If you manage on-street parking properly, you don't need to promote off-street parking, whether it's with minimum parking requirements or some other method. This very simple message was rammed home really forcefully and with a huge amount of detail and persuasive energy by Professor Donald Shoup from UCLA. His book, The High Cost of Parking, very often causes people to have something like a conversion experience on parking policy. Here's Tony Jordan from Portlanders for Parking Reform.
And I started reading this book and I was blown away. I was like, wow, I can't believe I've never thought about this. This is so impactful and important. Just every time I would see these ratios that made no sense or the zoning or development outcomes that would come from bad zoning laws regarding parking, I was like, this is really intense. And then a year or so later, we had a crisis of sorts in Portland with development of apartments. And I thought, well, I've read this book. I'm an expert. I'm going to go testify. And,
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a powerful book, isn't it? Despite being so long, it really is accessible to anyone can pick it up and get a real sense of this is an area of public policy that is being pursued in a profoundly stupid way, and it's low-hanging fruit for doing much better.
The potential savings and benefits are huge. In most situations, in a typical urban area, if we apply just the most cost-effective, reasonable parking management strategies, we can reduce the number of parking spaces needed by 30 to 50%. And if it's integrated with improvements to alternative modes. So if you simultaneously start charging efficient prices for parking and you greatly improve the bus or the train service to that area, you'll often get a 40 to 60% reduction in the number of parking spaces that are needed. That's huge savings, and it leverages reductions in traffic congestion and air pollution and accidents and consumer costs. So there are huge savings and benefits if we could do a better job.
As you might have recognized, that was Todd Littman again. You've been hearing what's wrong with minimum parking requirements and why they should be reformed or abolished. So what's happening in the real world? What are cities doing? Well, it turns out quite a few of them are abolishing minimum parking requirements.
Parking minimums were abolished in Berlin, the first city in Germany where it was totally abolished. And I have to add that it's not abolished for bicycle parking and parking spaces for disabled people. So there's still minimums for that. But the general parking minimums were abolished completely. And today, Hamburg, for example, as a second city in Germany, has also abolished its parking minimums. But Berlin was the first.
That was Jos Nino Notz talking about Berlin's parking minimums abolition in the Reinventing Parking edition that focused on Berlin. You might be thinking, those European cities, they're so progressive. But actually Berlin and Hamburg and many English cities are more exceptions. As we found out when talking with Fabian Küster in an episode that focused on both bicycle parking requirements and car parking requirements in Europe.
Bad practices. I mean, if you look at car parking, we still find many places where minimum norms are prescribed at national or regional level. For example, if you look at Vienna, it has a minimum norm in place for car parking.
Right. The car parking requirements in Hungary that I saw in the report are rather shocking. I think it was one space for every 20 square meters for offices and similar for shopping.
You're right. The regulations for office building, one space per 20 square meters is a lot. That's something that should not be applied, honestly.
So there's room for improvement even in some European countries. Actually, parking reform is a hot topic in many parts of the world, even in very automobile-dependent areas such as the United States. In January's edition of Reinventing Parking, we tackled Auckland, which is a very car-dependent city, but one which is trying to turn itself around. I talked with Matt Lowry from the Greater Auckland blog about parking reforms there.
One of the requirements around the unitary plan was that it had to be evidence-based, and so therefore the evidence that the likes of Donald Shoup and others people have done locally played a part in that. So prior to that, very centre of Auckland had parking maximums, and it still does, and so that was that has been a key part in driving some of the other change in the central city around public transport and walking and cycling usage and what have you. But in the rest of the area, it's like many Western cities had parking minimums that were that made it much harder to develop sites. And so for most areas within Auckland now, parking minimums have been removed.
In November 2018, I spoke with Andres Sanudo about Mexico City's abolition of minimum parking requirements.
It's an abolishing of the minimums, but it was also substituted with a maximum. In general, you could say that the new maximum it's what the previous minimum used to be. In some cases, it might differ, but just to make it like a simple explanation, that's what happened, and it's citywide.
Andres mentioned maximums there, and that might sound drastic to some of you, parking maximums instead of minimums. My view on maximums is they're very appropriate in really transit-oriented areas where you really need to reduce traffic. But in other areas, maybe you may or may not need them. In the case of Mexico City, the maximums are not as drastic as they sound. They simply replaced the old minimums, which were very high, with maximums. But in order to discourage excessive supply of parking, they have one more element to the reform. Here's Andres again.
And then the third, like the cherry on the top, was to get a fee, like a financial incentive that would charge developers that wanted to provide a lot of parking in their projects, and as long as they wanted to approach or to be close to the maximum, they would have to pay more for the parking spaces in their projects, and that money would have to be used for improvements in public transportation.
This is another great example of how abolishing minimum parking requirements involves a change of mindset. Once we get rid of this mindset that every building needs to cater to its own parking demand, everything changes. Usually, if parking is deficient in a building, that's considered an impact on the neighbourhood, that the parking will spill over. The new mindset is such that no, providing parking, especially providing excessive parking, is the thing that has an impact. It has an impact on the city by encouraging car ownership, encouraging excessive traffic, and overloading the roads of that city.
Yeah, exactly. That was at the center of our arguments the whole 6 years or 7 years that we were advocating for this. Changing like the vision that parking was an impact mitigator and turning into the parking, or at least excessive parking and free parking. It's not an impact mitigator, but it's exactly the opposite. It's the guarantee of impact.
But maybe you're still worried about the impact of having parking spilling over into neighbouring areas, into residential streets. But remember, on-street parking management is powerful. There are techniques, there are methods to manage that excessive spillover parking. Nevertheless, if you're still worried about it, there are also things that can be done on site in the buildings to mitigate the risk. Here's Todd Littman again.
One of the strategies that I highly recommend is called contingency-based planning. And that means that rather than expecting planners and engineers to do the impossible, that is, expecting them to predict how many parking spaces that new development could ever need over the course of its lifetime, we say, okay, you can build to the lower end of what you think is necessary, provided that you have a plan which identifies the additional parking management strategies that you would deploy if what you build turns out to be insufficient. So let's say you're building an apartment building and it's got 100 units, but it's located near downtown. And so you think that you only need, let's say, 60 parking spaces for a 100-unit apartment building, but the zoning code requires you to build 100 parking spaces. You say, no, let's build the 60. And here's what we'll do if 60 turns out to be insufficient. And that could include that you make an arrangement with the nearby church to use their parking lots during peak periods, or you might implement on-site car sharing to give residents better travel options, or you might start charging for those parking spaces, unbundle the parking and charge a little bit more. Or you could give the residents a free transit pass. There are many things that you can do.
So actually, even if you keep the mindset that parking demand should be contained more or less on site, or that it's the responsibility of the building owners to handle, even then there are things you can do, as Todd just said. But the really profound change that helps us escape even thinking about needing minimum parking requirements is to change our mindset, to think that parking is something that should generally be open to the public. It's something for the neighborhood. It's not something for every single site. I call this mindset a walkable parking mindset. Walkable parking. And there was an episode about that. It was a solo episode by me. I want to end with one more really important issue here. Activism. It's a crucial element in so many of the cities that have reformed their parking minimums, is that a coalition emerged to lobby and push and argue and debate and make the case that parking minimums make no sense. Here's Tony Jordan again from Portland.
It's important to have a group like Portlanders for Parking Reform so that you can tell the pedestrian advocacy group or the bicycle advocacy group or the environmental group or the transit riders when something's coming up. Like we need and track that. Also, a lot of groups concerned about the political ramifications of coming out front on such a generally considered contentious issue as parking. And so having someone who's willing to, someone or an organization that's willing to be the vanguard there and take the heat, which actually isn't that hard so far, kind of clears the way a little bit and demonstrates that this is not really as, it's certainly contentious, but it's not as dangerous a space, I think, as people think it is.
So you heard Tony alluding to coalition building there. It turns out coalition building was really important in Mexico City, where ITDP, along with several others, built a coalition, a powerful coalition. There were the usual suspects, but they didn't leave out one important group, developers. Listen to Andres explain.
I would have to recognize first that a very strong part of the coalition was the people inside the Ministry of Urban Development in the city government, and also in the Ministry of Mobility. And then also the natural allies, like bicycle advocacy groups as Bicitecas or the Bici Red. They were like natural allies in trying to push forward these kind of reforms. Also, other transportation organizations such as Embark or nowadays WRI. So, well, obviously the IMCO, which is the Mexican Institute of Competitiveness, like a business-friendly and competitiveness think tank.
It's a very interesting coalition. Were housing affordability advocates part of it as well?
Yeah, as well. Also developers, especially developers that are medium or small developers.
It was a similar story in Auckland. Activism made all the difference. Let me insert a comment here to emphasize something that Matt and I didn't discuss explicitly in our conversation. Auckland's parking reforms didn't happen by magic, of course. They came after a sustained campaign over several years. Especially effective was the youth organisation Generation Zero with their Bin the Mins campaign. In other words, trash the parking minimums. The Greater Auckland blog, formerly Transport blog, was also important, with numerous articles on the issue. Were you alarmed by that mention of developers as part of the coalition against minimum parking requirements in Mexico City just now? Here's Andres Sanudo again to address that issue.
And that's another strong point of the work that we did during those years. Sometimes groups who are activists who are trying to abolish minimums, sometimes you don't want to bring developers into the table because they are on the dark side or whatever. It's useless. You have to bring them on the table because they are the ones who are going to use the instruments, and they have a very informed opinions.
I guess the message is aim for an inclusive coalition if you can. Thanks for listening to this special and slightly unusual episode of Reinventing Parking. I hope you enjoyed it. Feedback, as always, is most welcome. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.